Welcome, friends, to tonight's program. I'm Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network. Tonight, we're going to listen on Jim Mitulski and Suzanna Krivulskaya discussing her new book, Disgraced, How Sex Scandals Transformed American Protestantism. Disgraced is a sweeping religious and cultural history of ministerial sex scandals in the 19th and 20th century. Krivulskaya investigates the cultural consequences of scandal, what demands the public made of religion in response to revelation of pastoral misdeeds, and how Protestantism itself changed in the process. The book covers both the most sensational and well-known scandals, as well as never before examined cases of ministerial impropriety. Through this research and analysis, Krivulskaya reveals the historical background for current reactions to charismatic religious authority and to sexual abuse. Suzanna Krivulskaya is Associate Professor of History at California State University, San Marcos, where she teaches courses in gender, religion, and digital history. She specializes in modern US history and studies the relationship between sexuality and religion. Krivulskaya was the 2019-20 honoree for LGBTQ-RAN's Award for Papers. The Reverend Dr. Jim Mitulski is a pastor, activist, community organizer, and fundraiser. He has pastored churches in the United Church of Christ and the Metropolitan Community Churches. He serves as the denominational director of development and clergy vocations for the MCC churches and taught courses at Pacific School of Religion and currently at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Jim is currently pastor of the Congregational Church of Belmont in California and is an LGBTQ-RAN board member. And now I am pleased to welcome Jim Mitulski and Suzanna Krivulskaya to begin this presentation.
Thank you, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. And we are so happy to be here tonight to talk about Disgraced, How Sex Scandals Transformed American Protestantism, this wonderful new book by Suzanna Krivulskaya. And Suzanna, I just want to start out by saying how much I love your book. It's given me many hours of great reading pleasure. And I also love all the things that you tie together, not only in the historical record, but in issues that are so relevant to what's happening right here, right now, particularly in the United States in regard to religion.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for your very generous and elaborate reading. I can see by the sticky notes in there.
I'm a great believer in the Post-it note as the greatest help to American scholarship. I think we should just probably launch right in. You look at three different periods in particular in American history: 1830s, 1870s, and a century later. You take us through a number of juicy scandals regarding the church, and particularly the Protestant church. But of course, what happens in Protestantism affects everybody else. I wonder if you could even just tell us what you mean by that word scandal that jumps out to us.
Right. So scandal, the way that I'm using it in the book, has to do with both a transgression of a principle that is, publicly proclaimed and embraced, and when that principle gets broken, and a certain level of public attention that results from the transgression. So it's not, there are plenty of sensations that I could write about, but scandal to me has to rise to that level of notoriety, and this has to do with the kind of cultural clout of the protagonists of each particular case study.
Well, and it's not like there's been any shortage of scandalous behavior among church people anywhere in any historical period. But you talk about how scandals, when these shortcomings, when they become public, take on a particular meaning, a particular life of their own. So can you talk a little bit about that? What's different about religious scandals in our history, and particularly around clergy?
Right. So the project started, when I wanted to look into whether and how scandal changes anything for American religion, because indeed, there is no shortage of scandal in this history. And so I was particularly interested in sort of three parallel strands and following those. The first is how journalists write about these stories. The second is how the church and various denominations or institutions respond to them. And the third is what the public may demand in as a reaction to the revelation of a particular scandal. And so I try to take us from kind of these three parallel tracks from the 1830s to the early 1990s, which is a tremendously wide timeline. And thank you to my dissertation committee for allowing me to take on such a project. The book had been, a version of it was my dissertation at Notre Dame. But in terms of the journalism aspect of it all, what makes religion interesting and special is that when we start out in the early republic in the 1830s, the press is still very much concerned with preserving the reputation of Protestant pastors. The new democratic experiment is fairly young, and the founders were concerned with what democracy would mean. And the press wanted to make sure to uphold public morality, and they were very hesitant at first to write stories that might, as they saw it, introduce new ideas about, human fallen nature as they discussed them. And so initially, there's a lot of hesitation about should we even publicize this stuff if it involves Protestant pastors? And this changes. The newspapers come to embrace the genre of scandal really in the Gilded Age. By the 1870s, there is a marked rise in stories of ministers misbehaving. And it's not until the 20th century that the Protestant church makes a concerted effort to focus on PR and reach out to newspapers. One of the things they also begin doing is they try to cover things up a little bit better. And the legacy of that is still with us to this day. So that's kind of a preview of why I think, religion makes such an interesting subject in terms of scandal.
Well, and even public perceptions about what's appropriate to talk about. If we can't talk about sexuality in public without it being accused or characterized as obscenity, how do we tell the story of what the church's transgressions are? And I know that there are more than one kinds of scandal. In my own work as a pastor, even I've often found that where there's a sex scandal, there's often a money scandal.
Hmm.
They're not unrelated, the lack of boundaries and the lack of regulation. But that does seem to be an important piece of this, that not only are people reluctant to talk about it, they're reluctant to be specific about the nature of the transgressions.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I try to make sort of modest claims about what scandals can do because, you know, a more cynical person might look at this history and say, well, nothing ever changes, right? They're all the same. Um, as a historian, I do trace change over time, and that interests me, how things are different in different eras. But one sort of hopeful takeaway from the book for me is that, as you're pointing to, Jim, is that these stories do not necessarily fundamentally change the church, right? They don't rewrite wrongs. Survivors are rarely listened to and respected as they ought to be. But what does happen is that new conversations around previously taboo subjects uh, start being had in the public sphere through the press. So that's a generative kind of feature of scandal.
Well, let's pick a scandal and talk about it. A good representative one. I don't know if you have do you have a favorite? Do you or
Beecher's good. Henry Ward
I
Beecher.
love the Beecher story because I'm a Congregationalist pastor, and today the United Church of Christ is very progressive on many things, but we can hardly point fingers at any other religious group when it comes to scandal. It seems like we specialized in it. I don't know if it's because of our Puritan roots or what, but uh, let's talk about Henry Ward Beecher, America's favorite pastor,
Right.
and
The most famous man in America, as one biographer called him. So he is from this prominent family. He's the son of another famous pastor. He's the brother to Harriet Beecher Stowe. The entire clan is really, really important in American history. And he is a Brooklyn pastor who, I jokingly sort of explain him to people as like the Oprah of his day, right? He was a big deal. People flocked to his church. He was charismatic. He was an abolitionist. He was a, a women's rights activist, sort of question mark. Um, but he was a tremendously important person in the Gilded Age. In 1872, a spiritualist by the name of Victoria Woodhull, who herself is a fascinating character, the
yeah,
first woman to run for president in the US. Spoiler alert, she did
yeah.
not win. Um,
And
but
her running mate is Frederick
her
Douglass.
running mate, Frederick Douglass, yes,
Yeah.
just an incredible, really impressive person who believed in what she called free love. And what it really meant was the ability of people to enter and exit relationships as they want without government interference. And so Woodhull, along with some other people, had heard some rumors that two members of Henry Ward Beecher's congregation, Elizabeth and Theodore Tilton, Elizabeth had confessed to her husband Theodore that she and Reverend Beecher had had an inappropriate relationship, sexual relationship. The rumors were around for a couple of years, and then in 1872, Woodhull decides to publicize them. And the reason she publicizes them is because, she says to call out Beecher's hypocrisy. Here again, the subject of how scandal helps bring things into the public view is really important because she's really not in it to make money off the story, though she does. Issues of her newspaper sell out really quickly. It becomes this huge sensation. But as she explains it in the story, is that she wants Beecher to come out and say that he too is a free lover because,
Mhm.
as um, at one point she makes a comment in a public meeting that, Beecher preaches to multiple mistresses in his congregation every Sunday, which was, of course, the rumor that, you know, was pretty likely true, actually.
Yeah.
And so she makes the story public. The church investigates, another question mark about the extent of their investigation, and he is proclaimed innocent of the charges by the church. They also withdraw membership from Theodore Tilton, who at that point is trying to get some justice. And it's not until 1875 that Theodore Tilton takes Beecher to court for what's at the time known as alienation of affections between the two spouses, and Beecher being the culprit. And
And Beecher is wildly popular even through this, and
right,
his critics are mostly, when they criticize him, it has to do with his so-called liberal theology, which it is liberal compared to Calvinism. But here's Woodhull saying, no, that's the least of it. His
right,
sexual impropriety is what you should be upset about, and they don't want to hear it. I mean, even though there's
right.
multiple attestation.
Well, right, and that's where that public piece comes in, right? That, I looked at a bunch of letters of support that had come in at the time to him. And people are really placing a lot of faith and trust in this person. They write things like, if you fall, my religion will fall with you, right? My faith will fall with you. They really connect his spiritual leadership with their own salvation in some ways. So he continues to enjoy broad support. And in fact, Woodhull gets arrested for publishing the piece by our friend Anthony Comstock. You may have heard recently about the Comstock Act and how it's still um, relevant to conversations about contraception, for example, because he passes this, or he helps pass this anti-obscenity act in which, speaking of taboo subjects, right, sex and whatever the government, I guess, deems to be obscene cannot be sent through the mail. And so what that does is that it prevents a lot of people who were probably critical of Beecher from speaking out against it in print for a few years. Now, once the civil trial begins in 1875, then there's lines outside of the Brooklyn courthouse. People start speculating on tickets and making some extra money because there's so much interest in the case. And the trial lasts for 6 months. We have all the transcripts of it. Um, it becomes quite a production, and it ends in a hung jury. And so Beecher gets off relatively unscathed. If anything, he has more visitors to his church until he retires. And of course, the lives of the Tiltons are changed profoundly. Theodore is jobless. He leaves and spends the rest of his life in Paris. Elizabeth, they divorce. They had 2 children, and Elizabeth becomes a recluse. She stays in Brooklyn, and rumor had it that she would not allow newspapers into her house until her death because she felt that publicity had done enough damage to her family.
So it's not just public accounting or reckoning. This spectacle also becomes almost like entertainment for people. It's a new form of entertainment because it's a religious figure that's involved.
Right. There's Puck, the newspaper, will print many, many cartoons sort of making fun of Beecher and the hypocrisy that they perceive there. There are popular songs that are being sung. We have some sheet music for them about the case, and it becomes, yeah, quite a spectacle, as you said.
And Beecher dies not that long afterwards, right? So
1887, right?
so I don't know. What do you think he might have come to a worse end? I mean, he doesn't seem to really have been punished for this.
He really wasn't your church, Jim, does another investigation later on and says he's fine. He also, I suspect, right, brings in a lot of money and attention to the church, which will be the case with a century later in the stories that I tell as well. And so the people who are charismatic and who are good for the publicity of any denomination tend to be protected by their churches.
Right. Well, and this lays the groundwork for churches' complicity in since they can't beat the press, in a sense, they create their own ways of handling publicity, including collusion, really, with the media
Right.
in subsequent generations.
Right.
We have one person, I love this question, says, because we had talked about this before. This may be beyond your scope, but I would be interested in hearing about Amy Semple McPherson's scandals. And I know that that's jumping ahead to another era, but do you want to say a little bit before we talk about her? How does the press and the church start to sort of collude together to manage stories like this?
In the early 1900s, denominations and institutions like the Moody Bible Institute, for example, recognize that they have a big problem on their hands, that the publicity that Protestant churches are receiving is devastating to their reputations. And so, you know, it's hard to find evidence of actual collusion, but there is some references in sort of internal correspondence among fundamentalist and evangelical leaders from the time that make it clear that there are several scandals that they're trying very hard to not make public. And it seems like some local journalists, in particular in that case in Chicago, are aware but are not printing about them. So again, the evidence there's thin, but there's, it seems to me that there's enough of it, enough cases where they begin to send problematic pastors away, send them to sanitarium. In the early 20th century too, we have a lot more cases of same-sex misdeeds, or however you want to label them, between pastors and other men. And so there is a growing culture of secrecy around that stuff that is very much, I think, self-conscious and meant to direct attention away from the scandals and toward, look at the good deeds that we're doing and look at the good that the church does for the world. Churches begin to form publicity departments, with a goal of advertising in newspapers and promoting their cause. So there's a kind of a new generation of leaders who recognize just how far, how much scandal had damaged their reputations.
Let's take a look just for a moment, since someone asked about it, at Aimee Semple McPherson, the evangelist who founded the for International Church of the Foursquare Gospel in Los Angeles. If you've been, the Angelus Temple, a great provider of social services to the poor during the Depression and the those who aren't working, and at the same time, because of the lack of regulation around particularly the emergent evangelical churches, anyone can become a minister if you can build a ministry. And that even helps, in this case, break a gender barrier for Aimee Semple McPherson, who, she's a complicated person. I know even her own denomination has had trouble acknowledging her wrongdoings, or her shortcomings, maybe is a better word for it. Um, she seems to really have believed her own stuff in a sense, and she's complicated. But tell us about her scandal, at least.
Right. Complicated, fascinating. Here's somebody who loves publicity of all kinds. She starts out as a missionary with her husband, and then he dies as soon as they have their first child, unexpectedly very young. And she feels called to ministry, and so she begins to travel the country with her gospel message. She's tremendously effective and attractive on many levels to people. And so by the time she lands in Los Angeles, it's also the time when we have the birth of Hollywood, and
Right.
she's very much embodying the spirit of glamour and artistry. She puts on what she calls illustrated sermons, which are essentially like plays. And so you can see her in various elaborate outfits. Um,
Well, and
and
they're big costume dramas too, right? Not just her, but cast
right, right.
of hundreds, literally, in putting
Yes.
on these Sunday productions. Again, entertainment, the nexus with entertainment and religion.
Yes, right. And she, she faces so much criticism, but she says, "Look, if you have a better way of getting so many people to come in, you tell me about it. I don't, and she has a lot of conviction in, the calling of being a minister, woman and all, here she is, and she's deputizing other women to start their own ministry. So, a really, really fascinating figure. You can still visit. The Angelus Temple is still in Echo Park. You can go see it. Her denomination is still alive and well and quite large. But in 1926, in fact, I was looking at the dates. It was May 18th, 1920, so just 99 years ago, she disappeared from a beach in Venice. She was there with her secretary, and the first assumption was that she had drowned, and the city is in mourning. Her followers are in mourning. They begin to plan for funeral services, etc. But the body is not found. Long story short, well, they're in the month that she is gone. There are multiple alleged sightings of her or somebody who looks like her. What makes it all the more suspicious is that at the same time as Aimee Semple McPherson disappears, her married radio operator goes missing as well. And so the assumption is that perhaps it's not a drowning, but a romantic getaway from her busy life. Um, she appears in Mexico at the border, in a border town just south of Arizona. And she tells the story of being kidnapped and being kept in a shack. Um, and the details are sort of unclear, and she doesn't look quite emaciated. She doesn't look dirty. You know, she has this whole story about walking through the desert all day. So there's a lot of suspicions introduced from the get-go to her account of what happened. And nonetheless, she comes back to LA victorious. People, you know, thousands of people are greeting the train. And journalists cannot get enough of the story. And then the district attorney begins to look into the case, and eventually there is a grand jury inquiry into, you know, potentially orchestrating the fake kidnapping. It doesn't really, the DA eventually sort of gives up and does not want to spend any more time or money investigating the case. And she returns to ministry. And to this day, the archivists at Foursquare will, you know, tell you that of course she was kidnapped, and of course she wasn't out gallivanting with the radio operator. Um, and there are books that they publish attempting to you know narrate their version of the story. And to me, listen, it doesn't matter what I think happened, right? What
Right.
was fascinating to me about the story in terms of the book is the changing nature of journalism around this time. So,
Yeah.
one unexpected thing that happens is that the so-called journalism is going through a lot of changes. They're articulating new um, principles that have to do, you know, with decency and truthfulness in reporting. They're sort of trying to move away from the sensationalist yellow pages. And one unexpected thing that occurs is that the so-called intellectual press, people like H.L. Mencken,
Mm.
Dorothy Parker, unexpectedly sort of come to defend McPherson, not because they think she is not lying about her disappearance, but because they view the campaign against her by the conservative press and by more conservative evangelicals, Protestants, as a kind of persecution of a really successful, fiery, talented woman. And so that to me was just a really fascinating finding, and kind of the meaning that I took from the story, aside from what it is that she was doing for those, you know, for the month that she was gone.
Well, I really loved the material you surfaced about from both Mencken and Dorothy Parker, because they're not sympathetic. They have not a moment's sympathy for religion, really,
Right.
but they do have an analysis that I thought was really interesting. And in the end, she doesn't suffer. I mean, she suffers in her personal life, I'm sure. I wouldn't even judge that. But um, it's different from what happens if we skip ahead to the 1980s, when there's a kind of a new trope introduced of confession and restoration, when we look at some of the scandals there, for some, but not for others. So if you look at Jimmy Swaggart, or Jim Baker, which are two very different stories, but with somewhat different endings in some ways. And that's a curious dynamic. I mean, but it seems like part of this drama is, if you confess in a public and dramatic and convincingly enough way, and if enough people see it because of new media, uh, it's not a game changer. It's not a career ender, to be
Yes.
involved in a scandal.
Yeah, so this is the period that I think introduces the beginning with maybe even a little bit earlier with Billy James Hargis,
Yeah.
who doesn't confess. So everybody up until him, they don't confess. But what he introduces into the dynamic of how scandals play out is that he obfuscates a lot. Like he'll say, I am, of course, a sinner, but he won't specify what sin it is that we're talking about, right? Particular sexual sin. And then with Jim Baker, who's of course accused of both sexually assaulting a young woman, and then also financial fraud. And in the wake of all of those revelations, there's also evidence of some same-sex encounters. And Baker, for a while, in fact, it's not just Baker, but the entire denomination, which is the Assemblies of God, has this plan of restoring him to his position. And only when the revelation of the possible bisexuality comes out, do they defrock him. And then he gets, uh, thanks to the press in North Carolina, who looked into his financial affairs, they found out both about the fraud that he was committing through his ministry, but also about the payoff that the ministry made to the woman who had been allegedly sexually assaulted by him 7 years earlier. And so that comes to light. And initially, Baker and his wife, Tammy Faye, who deserves many books of her own, what a star, um, they, they deny. He tries to portray the sexual incident in that hotel room with Jessica Hahn as entirely consensual and only done to make Tammy jealous because she had been having an affair. So we find out a lot about their private lives kind of in the aftermath. But he then, despite being convicted, he is then offered or given a lesser sentence. He ends up being, free 5 years later, and he publishes this book called I Was Wrong. And to me, just such a funny um, piece of evidence, because you think, oh, here he is, here's this preacher confessing to being wrong. And of course, if you read to the end, the thing that he says that he was wrong about is that God would never let him preach again. And here he is triumphantly returning to preaching. In fact, you can watch his program from Branson, Missouri. I believe they film daily. He is married to a new wife. He's still alive and well. He sells apocalyptic buckets of dehydrated food, for, I'm sure, a reasonable price. He promotes various Trump coins. So, he's back to it. And the thing that he thinks he's wrong about is God's, desire for him to be in the public eye and to be preaching still.
Well, and you contrast that with a simultaneous, well, not quite simultaneous, but uh, scandal involving Jimmy Swaggart, who, for his other shortcomings, was not guilty of homosexuality, which does seem to be, in addition to blaspheming the Holy Spirit, the thing that the Pentecostal Church sees as an unforgivable sin, no queerness. But Swaggart is really even more outrageous, really, in some ways, in his not only his behavior, but he just keeps doing it, and then there's no consequence for it.
Right, right. So ironically, when in the aftermath of the Baker fallout, one of the people that the press goes to for comment is another charismatic televangelist preacher by the name of Jimmy Swaggart. What is happening with these ministers? And of course, he tries to minimize what's actually happening. Um, Swaggart had previously confronted a colleague of his, a fellow Louisiana minister, with rumors of infidelity and adultery. And he essentially made that minister step down from his position. That minister, his son happened to be on the police force in Louisiana, outside of where Swaggart was living, and arranged to bring his dad, who was this now grumpy former pastor, to a seedy motel that the son knew Swaggart liked to visit to employ sex workers. And the father and son duo slashed his tires and confronted him, took pictures. So they had evidence, they had dirt on him. So what happens there is Swaggart arranges this televised confession. He's tearful. He once again, just like Billy James Hargis, 15 years earlier, he kind of confesses to this general sinfulness, but he doesn't really, go into the details of what it is that he did. He is apologetic to his wife and children, but um, the Assemblies of God requires a longer period of sort of repentance and redemption than he would like. So he just says, yeah, I'm not going to follow the guidelines. I'm going to return to preaching, in a much shorter time. I think it was like 90 days or something. He was back in the pulpit. And then he gets caught again a couple of years later. 3 years later, he's driving with a sex worker. He gets pulled over because he's driving on the wrong side of the
Yeah.
road. Um, and what he does that time is tells his congregation, quote, "The Lord told me it's none of your damn business." And proceed. He undergoes a short amount of sort of therapy, he says, but his ministry continues. And
No.
yeah, there's nothing that was done to Swaggart.
Well, there's two things I want to say. One is you do draw attention consistently in your historical narration to dynamics of race, class, gender. It's mostly about American white Protestantism, but there's a great telling of or chronicling of the First Church of Deliverance in Chicago, a black church.
Mm.
You talk about gender and who gets away with what and why, and class too, I think is a dynamic. So I want to appreciate the all those awarenesses that are part of your narrative, and I know that people will want to read it. And you end up with one more sort of framing story about Ted Haggard, which illustrates, in a sense, how queerness is punished more severely than heterosexuality in some ways, uh, with the more recent narrative in Colorado with Haggard.
Yeah, so 2006, Ted Haggard is at the height of his power. He's the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. He has weekly phone calls with George W. Bush as Bush is contemplating a new constitutional amendment to make marriage defined as a union between a man and a woman. And this guy comes to the press and says, Pastor Ted is my client of a couple of years. The guy's name is Mike Jones. He's a sex worker, and he reveals that Haggard had come to see him multiple times on multiple occasions. They engaged in sexual encounters, and also Haggard occasionally purchased crystal meth from him. So there were more than one vice. Immediately, there's a disciplinary process, and the church does not want him to preach or to pastor, or at least for a while. He goes into therapy, he comes out proclaiming hilariously that he is now completely heterosexual, a claim that he would later walk back, pressed by people like Oprah on interviews about, come on, Ted Haggard, surely you're not completely heterosexual. And he says things like, well, if I were younger, I may be bisexual or something, but I'm, 54 with a wife and children. And so he really is hoping for the same kind of redemption. He doesn't quite get it. He has to start a new church. The new church, of course, as of 2022, had some new allegations of inappropriate behavior with some young men in the congregation. During COVID, they eventually move all services online. And that's kind of the last I've heard from Ted Haggard. But my understanding is that everything is online, which, hopefully protects the congregants that way.
Well, so one thing you show in this book is scandals don't go away. How we deal with them does change and
Mhm.
perhaps changes church over time. And I'm going to just do one quote. Perhaps the fundamental creative function of scandal is not punitive, but rather generative. It allows societies to name the things which are deemed unspeakable, unprintable, and otherwise taboo. Scandal may not result in grand or sudden social change, but it does sanction more honest conversations about the dangers and excesses of power, religious or otherwise. And I don't know, is Is that an optimistic take? Is there a positive social upside to scandal and its exposure and its engagement, or?
I mean, I think it's as optimistic as I can get,
Uh-huh.
because obviously we're as you mentioned at the start, right? We're still in this moment of profound reckoning with all kinds of abuses of power, sexual abuses, in the church and in not just churches, right? All kinds of religious communities, and so I think speaking about it is important. I think being clear and something that you brought up too with even the kind of mainline, more progressive churches, having honest conversations about sex and sexuality is just really, really important because, I quote our friend Mark Jordan in the introduction to that it's breaking these silences in church that may indeed have some hope for a healthier community, both within the congregation, but also outside of it.
These scandals don't go away. You have one sort of positive interpretation, but do you think that there's ever a moment where we satiate our appetite for these scandals and people just say, we are done with religion. This is too much. It's gone too far.
I can't speak to the future. I'm trained in the opposite. Um, I actually think that this attitude is not terribly productive. Like I think as I try to emphasize in the book, and particularly that last chapter and even the epilogue, um, that treating scandal, in particular scandals that involve abuses of power, as sort of commonplace results in a kind of complacency that I think can also translate to complicity, right? That, oh, well, of course they're doing this, right? And that makes us all in the institutions to which we belong, that are supposed to be safe spaces, a little bit less likely to raise hell about it. So I hope, right, that we continue to actually engage with these conversations and not get so tired that we just sort of walk away.
I'm going to read this question.
Mhm.
Does the author have any ideas on how scandal can be used more effectively to bring about positive change to institutions and communities? So much of what you're discussing seems relevant to other areas of like academia, business, science, where cover-ups are normal. Any ideas on how to do more to improve things? I mean,
That's a huge question. Yeah, being a whistleblower, talking about things openly, talking to allies within the organization, I think is a good first step. I think we are, I really admire throughout the stories that I tell in the book, the bravery of reporters. We can look at people who write about sensationalist stuff and kind of dismiss them as, they're just getting kind of cheap laughs in at the expense of these religious people. But I think they've just done tremendous work for uncovering that stuff. And I worry that in our particular political moment of suspicion around journalism and indeed what truth is, that we're losing this. So I think the kind of large scale continue supporting journalists. That's really important.
Mhm.
And then smaller ideas is just being transparent and honest with the groups and the people that you feel safe around. What do you think, Jim? I mean,
But
you
I think being
in the
willing to really listen to the people who have been affected by this egregious behaviors on the part of both clergy and the churches that in the past have really been more successful in silencing these voices. I'm not saying that there's been a big, huge turnaround, but it does seem that maybe because of Me Too also and other movements in the church that people are more willing to listen to the voices, and they're not demonized or marginalized or silenced in the way that has been characteristic to some extent of the past. That there's more voice and more power. I mean, you know, where I live in California, the local Catholic diocese has been unsuccessful in trying to evade financial and moral culpability for the priest scandals that continue to happen. It's not just Protestantism, it's also Catholicism, it's also religious institutions that aren't Christian too. So, you know, I feel some hope around that. I wonder if I could ask one personal question, and, you know, feel free to, you know, not. Has all this study affected your own faith journey? If I can ask.
Sure. Well, I guess my faith journey had led me to these questions. So I'm originally from Belarus. I went to college in Lithuania, and I'd met as a teenager some American evangelical missionaries, and I became an evangelical myself and wanted to become a missionary after graduation. And I was in college when the Ted Haggard scandal broke, and I was myself wrestling with questions of faith and sexuality, and I became really, really interested in sort of how did this evangelical project reach me in Belarus, and what am I now doing in this college in Lithuania? Um, and so eventually I went to Yale Divinity School and wanted to kind of study religion from a more academic perspective, and then finally got the PhD in history to you know, I I'm an agnostic at this point, but I have been with this material enough to where I think, I really don't relish the scandals that I write about. I don't the sort of juicy, titillating details of what these men, and they're mostly men, they're mostly white
Mhm.
men, as you point out, what they
Yep.
did or didn't do with with their bodies, it really does not matter to me as much as I'm just so interested in the discourse around what their actions, right, and their behaviors and their theologies, and accusations of hypocrisy, and what does hypocrisy mean, and what does it do when one is found to be hypocritical in their conduct? The Ted Haggard of it all, or me in college wrestling with the same issues as Ted Haggard probably was wrestling with, right? So I just think, I hope that the book is received in the spirit of genuine curiosity about the world and life and faith. And so, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Great. Susanna, I want to thank you for your scholarship. I want to thank you for this book, and I want to urge people who've been watching this to get this book. It bridges academic and accessible. And I think that, you know, even myself as a Christian pastor, conscious of the seedy history of the Congregationalist tradition, it didn't undermine my faith. It encouraged me to want to just seek out truth, you know, and that's what real healthy spirituality looks like, not being afraid of the truth. So thank you, thank you, thank you for this.
Thank you so much for this lovely conversation. And thank you to LGBTQ-RAN for allowing us this forum. Thanks to all the attendees, too. I think we have to throw it back to Mark.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. Isaiah put the coupon code, Oxford Unity Press, University Press. I actually used it. I have to admit, I haven't read the book yet. And I was so fascinated by the discussion that I placed my order during the webinar. So that discount code works. Encourage you to do that. Thank you so much, Susanna and Jim, for this fascinating conversation. There's so much more we could do. Within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with family and friends. If you're interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ-RAN website, and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, June 18th, entitled What Keeps Us Going? Elder Wisdom for Dangerous Times. In an historical moment when queer and trans lives are under attack, we turn to those who've been here before. LGBTQ-RAN board members Sharon Groves and Cedric Harmon will dialogue with three of our elders, Reverend Harry Knox, Reverend Lewis Mitchell, and Bishop Tanya Rawls, about how they faced crisis, carved out joy, built movements, and survived. Go to the events page on our website for more details and to sign up for the link to participate. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ-RAN is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ plus religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to stand strong in the face of attempts to erase our history, please help make this happen with our gift. You can just go to giveq.org. That's it, giveq.org on your phone, tablet, or laptop, or you can click on the donate button on the LGBTQ-RAN homepage. Your gift does make a difference. On behalf of everyone here, I want to offer again deep gratitude to Jim and Suzanna for their enlightening presentation. Good night to all.